Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bottom Culture Club. I am your host, Aletha, and I am so happy to see you guys back with me today as we discuss Toni Morrison's Sula. Also, if you didn't get a chance to check out the first introductory video for the Bottom Culture Club, to introduce our channel here, I'm going to pin that particular video in the description box. So make sure you guys take a few moments to really get a better understanding of the channel, our overall vision here. For those of you who are returning, welcome. As you guys know, the Bottom Culture Club is a collective. It is a space where we come together to celebrate really all things Black culture, but specifically through the lens of African American literature, through African American philosophy, culture, art, African American expression. So as promised, I had pointed out that I am thirsty to really get into this Toni Morrison text, especially the ending. If you guys remember, this particular text is a extension of a class I had, Contemporary African American Literature class, Lit 121. And my students and we had the opportunity to read and really discuss the text, but the semester kind of ended up before we really had that final discussion of the ending of the text. So I wanted to pick up there. So if you have not read Toni Morrison's Sula, I kind of want to give a disclaimer now. Spoiler alert. Okay. If you haven't read it in a while, I really want to encourage you to go back and read the text. This is a text that I taught in my Contemporary African American Lit, but I also taught in a basic writing course. I also taught it in my art class, which is aligned reading and composition. And the students in that class were, somewhat learning readers, or shall I say learning to read critically. So Sula itself, it isn't a hard read. And a lot of the themes in the text, somewhat salacious. So I could really get the students engaged in reading. But the discussion of the text, we took it up a notch in my Lit 121 class. And that's what I really wanted to focus on today, okay? So Toni Morrison Sula, this particular text was published in 1973, I believe. Hold on, let me fact check that really quickly. Yes, Sula 1973. Interesting, this is Toni Morrison's second text. Her first text, The Bluest Eye, that was published, I believe, in 72. So we're kind of seeing here the early stages, Toni Morrison, kind of developing her writing style. We do know that she was very intentional, very purposeful in how she told her story, okay? This isn't what I call a typical format. African American literature has to be read a specific way. And as I set up my Lit 121 class, we spend a lot of time really looking at the function of African American lit. And in discussing Toni Morrison, it's only right that I bring up her essay, Rootedness, Ancestor as Foundation, because she really lays out like a step-by-step guide of how African American literature should be read, okay? It's a different game we're telling. If you guys know anything about the oral storytelling tradition, if you know anything about how a lot of times when you read African American literature, it's rich in metaphor, it's rich in what I call adornment, use of similes, those superlative adjectives, really reading between the lines, okay? A lot of giving it to you, but not giving it to you, okay? Toni Morrison talks about how writing shouldn't be didactic in nature. You shouldn't necessarily be attempting to teach your audience, right? You simply share stories, and it's up to your audience in order to kind of connect with that writing and pull from it what they will. But she's always spoken up about not being didactic or prescriptive in nature. She's not attempting to lead her audience to think a particular way. And that's why it's always, really interesting and compelling to read a Toni Morrison novel. we dive into all of the conflicts, good and bad, again, this idea of good versus evil, joy and pain. She really will have the audience ultimately make their own decision. So in discussing this book today, I have a few notes, okay? And I want to, again, really quickly lay out a few things before we dive into it, because I'm going to move fast. What I like to do, I liked the format of the first video where I kept it a little bit under 30 minutes. I don't want to lose you guys, but sometimes I really can get a little bit long-winded. So I use my notes to kind of help me stay on track, all right? So bear with me as I'm kind of, engaging with the camera and looking away at my laptop, okay? So one thing to keep in mind, if you are not familiar with Toni Morrison or her writing, Sula is a really good book to start with, okay? One thing my father used to tell me, he would say, there's nothing new under the sun. And even though this particular book was published in 1973, and Sula itself, the story itself, I think it begins in like 1921. Yeah, like 1919. So even though it was published in 1970, she's still taking a look back, right? And with this idea that there's nothing new under the sun, even though we are in 2023, there are so many themes prevalent in Sula that mirror conversations we're having right now, that kind of takes us full circle, if you will, in struggles, political concerns that African Americans have always had to adjust to, okay? So we see that in Sula. But when we think about Toni Morrison, her style, when we think about the function of African American literature, I really want to highlight a few elements, okay? One thing you have to do when you approach African American literature, and this is according to Toni Morrison's essay, Rootedness, Ancestor as Foundation, she really encourages embracing the conflict, okay? So we're not kind of coming in as, I want to say goody two shoes. We're not kind of coming in judging the characters, right? The conflict is normally where the jewels can be found, okay? So we're embracing the conflict. We are looking at the story through that conflict, one as an individual, but also as part of a tribe, okay? So Toni Morrison kind of lays out the duality of individual and community, okay? One thing she's always stated, as many of the contemporary writers during this time, they were specifically writing for a Black audience. They felt like the most important stories to tell are their own stories. So this is kind of almost a for us, by us moment, the contemporary literary movement. We see a lot of movement into Black nationalism, kind of reaching back into our roots, kind of really going back to who we are. And I bring up again the sisterhood in discussing Toni Morrison. And I don't know if you guys, again, if you didn't check out that first video, I laid out a couple of elements that inspire the channel. And one specific is the contemporary African-American literary movement. And also this group of writers, this collective of women writers, the sisterhood. This particular collective, very instrumental, very influential in moving forward African-American literary canon, okay? Game changers, trailblazers. And Toni Morrison, as you guys can see here, one of the original members. So quick shout out again, if you guys aren't familiar, I'll make references often to the sisterhood. It's a collective that was formed in February 1977 of women writers with a specific focus of moving forward the art, raising Black consciousness through, artistic expression, okay? So Toni Morrison, very intentional with what she's doing with this. So you'll see these elements at play in Sula. So again, embracing the conflicts. Now, in what I want to talk about today, specifically with that ending of Sula, it is taking the story full circle, okay? Sula begins with Actually, it begins with Shadrach. Again, if you haven't read the book, this isn't a full review. This is kind of simply just that last ending. But I'm going to kind of glaze over the story just to kind of bring us all to the same point. Sula is all about, yes, the character Sula, but it's also about the community, the environment, and the experiences that shaped her. Okay. So from the beginning of the text, we learn about, again, this small town, the Bottom in Medallion, Ohio. Again, the inspiration for the title of this channel. But the Bottom was like any other African-American neighborhood. It carried its own, what I call joy and pain. Okay. It's where you see a lot of the residual effects of racism. You see a lot of the effects of politics, just the effects of blackness on not only the community, but the lives of its occupants, right? So with the text Sula, we open up with Shadrach, okay? A very prominent figure in this text because Shadrach and Sula tend to mirror each other, okay? Part of Sula's story is she is a misunderstood young black girl. She is raised by women who struggled with poverty, women who struggled in love, also women who have been neglected, not only by, let's say in some cases, spouses, parents, but just by society in general, okay? So the effects of that neglect, we see them manifest in Sula, okay? But Toni Morrison walks us slowly through that progression, okay? So Shadrach is how the book begins, because Shadrach, as a member of the Bottom, he is an outcast. He's a veteran. He came back with PTSD, mental health issues, but because he was a member of that community, right, he was embraced, but also ostracized. Let's say he's the stranger that they knew. They knew him to be quirky. They knew him to, to have his episodes. And what Toni Morrison was really depicting here was PTSD. She was depicting, even though it's not necessarily diagnosed as that. This again is 1919. She's telling the story beginning in 1919. So Shadrach was a young man coming home, I believe it was from World War II. And he is dealing with all of the effects of leaving while he was a child. I think he was like 17 or 18, coming back, having seen things a child should never see, have lost loved ones, and then coming back to a community that in some degrees rejects them. No one really understands what he had went through or what he had gone through. So early in the book, we meet Shadrach to kind of set up this need for, I don't want to call him a pariah, or a social outcast, kind of how there's always the need for the burdens of a community to fall on someone's shoulders, okay? And in this case, we began with Shadrach. But Shadrach was unique. He had the shoulders for the job, okay? I was really in tuned in reading and learning about Shadrach because although a lot of people thought he was crazy, Shadrach was not crazy. He's what perhaps maybe back in the day was seen as the medicine man, someone who depended a lot on, let's say ancestral wisdom, kind of his intuition, moving from within, right? And a lot of people may not understand that. So he was viewed a certain way. He also, again, would have public episodes with PTSD and things like that. So he gained somewhat a reputation. However, he was also responsible for starting traditions in the Bottom. So he started what was called a National Suicide Day, a suicide day where I call it a mental health day, where this is the day where you kind of take a look at, examine, or even just show an awareness that we are not okay. Okay, and I thought that was revolutionary in the text because everyone, although everyone in the community, they have similarities in that they grew up the same, they may have had similar experiences. Not everyone talks about it. Not everyone kind of expresses an understanding for what the other has gone through. And Shadrach tends to be an in-your-face representation of those traumas, right? So we meet him early on, and he's good because he is almost a mirror of Sula or what's to come. Okay, so I maybe spent too long saying that, but fast forward. All right, the ending of the text that I would really like to focus on. Sula has grown up. We saw early on her innocence, her finding a kindred spirit in Nel. Nel is a friend, Sula's best friend. I would call her sister, like they were one and the same. Those of you who read the text, Toni Morrison did a beautiful job of really depicting the friendship that two young girls shared, a necessary friendship. I know that the collective of the bottom will be my readers, my bookworms, but also, women who know the importance of sisterhood, who know the importance of, kind of having that support. And that's what Nel was to Sula, and that's what Sula was to Nel, okay? Really good friends. Came from this community, but they had their own individual identities. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. So as I'm kind of moving in between the story, I'm also applying Toni Morrison's prescription of how African American lit should function. Okay, and one thing she talked about is a single person could enter and behave as an individual within the context of a community. So I want us to think about Sula operating as an individual. We can think about that with Shadrach as well, but they're doing so within the context of the community. The community has shaped them, right? But the community also identifies them and names them, okay? In a similar way that society does, right? So we see that. So she feels that this concept, Toni, and when I say she, I'm talking about Toni Morrison, she feels that this concept of public versus private is very important because a lot of times, we have our public mind, one that we're willing to share, and then we have private that a lot of times, it makes us a little bit more vulnerable. We may not always be as willing to share. This is the uniqueness in Shadrach. Shadrach was going through something privately very intense, but that National Suicide Day, just him having breakdowns sometimes in public, that was him making the private public, and in doing so a lot of times change can happen. So Toni Morrison and a lot of writers during this contemporary movement, they follow this particular function where they're telling private stories. Okay, this is almost a whisper in your ear type of storytelling where in telling those private moments and making those private moments public, they're hoping to shift an awareness and consciousness in the audience, in the community. Okay, so when we talk about African American literature and Sula specifically, it's rooted almost in a narrative autobiographical form, where again, it is a single solitary life kind of told or viewed through the context of the public, up for judgment, right? But it's the sharing of experiences, insights, secrets that's designed to tell the people something that they didn't know. She's attempting to help you uncover something, okay? So Sula is here to hold up a mirror. We're reading Sula's story and diving into the private parts of her life in order to get insights or secrets, that can help us, right? Another thing, Toni Morrison talked about the function of African American literature. You share to heal, okay? So the story of Sula, even though at times, it can be conflicting, because I'm going to tell you guys, I've read this book several times, and up until this latest time, and I'm going to talk about it, I always was sure that I did not like Sula. I always was sure that Sula was wrong in what she did. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. And I used to feel like in all of the information that Toni Morrison gives us about Sula, it still is no excuse for her to, let's say, make the decisions that she made in life. That is how I felt previously reading Sula, okay? Where I am now currently in my life, Sula is my girl, okay? I see Sula totally different. And when Toni Morrison talks about this idea of sharing in order to heal, those private moments of Sula that I've read before, I want you guys to know I've read this before, but reading it again in the time and space that I'm in right now, I took something totally different from this particular text, and I'm going to share it with you guys. But it really did help in healing certain aspects of how I view people. You know, I used to be a very black and white person, right and wrong, you know, kind of this doing what you're supposed to do. But the sharing, Toni Morrison's sharing of Sula's story really helped me to kind of approach or view things differently. So we'll talk about that. Participation. Toni Morrison always talks about the audience participating in the text, the relationship between the artist and the speaker. So the writing, the storytelling is seeking to engage you, but also form a relationship with the artist, okay? So she says African-American literature should spark that participation. That's why it's important. I always tell my students it's important to know who the author is, when the text was written. All of those things help you to view time and space. What was going on in the world at that time? How did it influence the writer? How did it shape the story? Context is very important when you read African-American literature. They almost are always influenced historically, politically, socially. So looking for that or participating in that in the reading makes it easier for you to, for us to kind of follow the stories of the characters, okay? As she explains, and again, I'm quoting Toni Morrison here, as she explains, she writes to uphold the art. So again, very, very intentional here. It says, indicative of the cosmology, the way Black people look at the world. So the telling of the story, can I call it emphasizing faith, emphasizing myth, emphasizing folklore, the passing down of knowledge is really important. So participation, think of call and response, right? Very intentional with this, okay? So with that being said, I always ask, what do you think? Normally I would ask my students, what did they think about the text? We would normally have a page limit that students had to read like every week. And rather than me just kind of giving these reading comprehension questions, what did you feel? What did you think when you read the text, right? That's how the discussions would start. So let's talk about Toni Morrison, this ending. Let me tell you how I felt, okay? I felt after I finished reading the text, I felt like I was in mourning, okay? Again, if you haven't read Sula, spoiler alert, she dies at the end, okay? And to meet Sula at the beginning of her life, you know, she was a young girl. I think she was 7 when we met her early on. But we know her mother. We know her grandmother. You know, Toni Morrison pulled us into the family with this text, okay? So we know Sula. By the time we make it to the end, we know Sula. So I feel like I have, after finishing the book, I felt like I was mourning the loss of Sula. I felt hurt. You know, I felt it on an emotional level. And it was a hurt for Sula, the character, yes, but also for every Sula. Because Sula represents a Black girl experience, without a doubt. So in the way that Toni Morrison told this story, in my participation with the story, I felt a connection to the character, right? And I felt really sad upon finishing the story of Sula, okay? because the revelations, you guys, they really all came at the end. Okay, so again, just some things I want to make sure I'm not leaving out here. We talked about how we met Sula early on in the story, but before meeting Sula, we met Shadrach. Toni Morrison was very intentional with that. Shadrach represents the awareness of the mind in the story. He is unique, and if you guys know, again, from that first video, I talked about how I make connections to Christina Sharp's In the Wake, and she writes about a metaphorical ship and how the transatlantic slave trade, the making of blackness, almost sealed a proverbial fate. Okay, it's something that the genie cannot be put back in the bottle. The launching of those ships, hundreds of years ago, we still exist in the wake of that. Okay, we are still very much living a post-slavery experience, even in 2023, moving into 2024. So Shadrach, even though Toni Morrison wrote this in 1972, he represents an awareness of what's going on. And I really identified him as being hailed. Again, Christina Sharp breaks down in her book, In the Wake, she breaks down the Black experience by using the metaphor of the ship. So the wake is our current experience. We're kind of still caught up in the aftermath. And she talks about the hold, which is kind of that body, the bottom of the ship that held the slaves, how we are still proverbially held in that sense, okay? And even if not in body, in mind. So Shadrach represents, again, this mind, the awareness. His mental health issues really illustrate him being held, kind of suspended between life and death. Because what really messed Shadrach up, he did not understand war. He did not understand the rejection that came with being Black. He did not understand how after fighting for his country, he came back and still dealt with that, the sting of racism. It still impacted his life. So he's a good representation of the whole, being held, right? The community, the bottom represents that as well, okay? So Sula was raised in the bottom with all of the others. Again, when I think about Sula, her being a young Black girl in 1919, or I don't think she was born then. We start with Shadrach's story, so that was Shadrach. But I'll say by around 1920s, to be a young Black girl in 1920s, okay, Sula too was held, right? She knew about neglect, rejection, abjection. She knew that very well. When I think about Sula, I think about the rose that grew from concrete. And this refers to the rose birthmark that she had over her eye. Toni Morrison was very intentional in pointing out magical features of Sula, okay? She's not your average, right? That's, again, I'm going to say that Black girl magic, before it was even a term. We see it percolating in Sula as a young age, okay? At a young age. So yeah, she had this unique birthmark on her eye, and it was a rose. And when I think of rose, it's delicate, but it's tough. Rose is kind of embodied by thorns, beautiful, soft, fragrant. It really represents love, friendship, but don't play with it. It also has, those thorns. So Sula's existence was mirrored in Shadrach. I'll kind of say, what do they call it? Foreshadowed, right, in Shadrach. The existence of despair, of hopelessness, that really you could see on the faces of the residents of the bottom, right? So again, like a flower, with me calling Sula the rose that grew out of concrete, like a flower or any creature in nature, she was shaped by and held by her environment, which is that bottom. Now with Sula, you guys, Sula's family did not set Sula up for success, okay? And again, I know we can look at that in any case whose family had, but she had to contend with a lot. Okay, so with that being said, I'm about right at 30 minutes, and I did not want it to go this long. But I'll try to get through this really quickly. I'll try to wrap it up fast. So again, with Sula being shaped by her environment, she's also shaped by time. Now, with the last portion of this text that I want to talk about, Toni Morrison outlines each chapter with a date. Okay, so we're kind of walking through a timeline in the text. So in 1937, around this time, Sula is in her 20s. I believe. I know she has been gone from the bottom for 10 years. She left to go to college. You know, Sula gives me gypsy vibes. She really was not meant to be contained. And anybody who read the book, you know that she could not be contained by societal norms. She couldn't be contained by the patterns and patterns of her mother and grandmother, even though she kind of did take it, but she made it her own. We'll talk about that. But in 1937, this is kind of where I'm picking up the text. Sula returns to the bottom. So now she's older. She's no longer that little girl, but she has taken the lessons. She's taken the wisdom from her time in the bottom, that environment that has shaped her. And she's kind of formed this life philosophy, okay? And as she comes back, Sula also comes back with I almost want to call it a swarm of birds, robins, okay? So what was known in the atmosphere when Sula returns to the bottom is birds, right? There were lots of robins. She talks about this. She said, accompanied by a plague of robins, Sula came back to Medallion. That's how it starts, right? So the word plague, okay, Sula and what she represents almost is like a plague on the community, okay? But when I think about robins, when I think about birds, I think about messengers. I think about swords. I think about spirits. I think about truth. I think about awakening. I think about communication, right? So Sula's coming back with a message, right? She's coming back with something to say. She's coming back with a particular spirit that's kind of fueling her, how she moves, okay? I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around here. So we're talking about time, 1937. Also important to point out that in 1937, even though this is a time in the book, 1937 is when Zora Neale Hurston published Their Eyes Were Watching God. Now, if you guys know anything about Queen Mother Zora Neale Hurston, she was revered by the contemporary African-American writers, especially the women. Alice Walker, if you guys know Alice Walker, writer of The Color Purple, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, that essay specifically discussed or described the reverence for Zora Neale Hurston. Actually, the members of the sisterhood, this collective of writers, they referred to her as mother, like she was a guide to them, okay? So when I think of 1937, I'm like, wink, wink, nod, nod, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. But also just to know what was going on in the world at that time. I believe Joe Louis became heavyweight champ that particular year. And again, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God was published. So, I don't think Toni Morrison does anything by accident. So I'm going to take that as very intentional. And again, of course, the organizing the chapters by dates, again, I believe Mother Morrison did that on purpose. It helps to reflect the weather. It helps to, and that again is a Christina Sharp term. It helps to reflect what the characters had to contend with, right? What is shaping the story or even their reactions to it, okay? All right, so when I say weather, I'm talking about environment. So the environment in 1937, okay? That means we're coming off the Harlem Renaissance. There was Hope coming into that. You guys know the Great Migration. Hope, but that hope was quickly dashed by industrialism, racism, politics, redlining. A lot of things influenced Black life in 1937, but prominently, I'm going to say, is poverty, okay? A lot of the promises made or the ideals that moving north for a better life would bring, this new freedom. By 1937, a lot of those ideas were being dashed, right? Also, a lot of old ideas were being replaced with forward thinking. So I want you guys to think of Sula and her making this return as almost a moving forward of time. We're going to see a changing of the guard, if you will, okay? So yeah, this is the environment, 1937. It says, and I told you guys, I'm keeping notes so I can stay on track. It says, as fellow readers, seekers, the experience of Sula and her family, the bottom, connect with literature, music, and art of the naturalism, modernism, and realism movement. Now, again, if you guys watched that first video, a lot of the information that I pull from comes from the Norton Anthology on African American Literature. And in that particular text, we meet the movement of realism, naturalism, and modernism. It's that literary movement after the Harlem Renaissance. That's where we meet Gwendolyn Brooks, Lorraine Hansberry, Ralph Ellison. Even though we get glimpses of him during the Harlem Renaissance, he becomes a best-selling author, establishing himself amongst the canon during this particular movement. So, what's happening during this time? The writers, I'm sorry, I shook my camera. The writers are rejecting the teachings of the elders, okay? It's almost as though they're saying, we tried it your way and your way didn't work. So we're taking that and, we're trying something new, okay? Sula to me represents that ideal. And and even in me kind of pointing out Lorraine Hansberry, if you guys remember Raisin in the Sun, if you remember Beneath Her, and if you remember her position in the family, she was the one going to college. She was the one kind of feeling like, why should I get married and have kids? She was kind of looking at the traditions that the previous generation gave and was like, who is this for, right? Like, what am I going to do with this? How does this benefit me? And we see Sula doing this as she returns in 1937, okay? So she's gone off. She's done college. She comes back to the bottom and she goes back to her childhood home. The first person she encounters is her grandmother. If anybody remembers Eva Peace, I have beef with Eva Peace. Although I try to understand her as well, okay? Again, she was a product of her environment. And this is Sula's grandmother, you guys, okay? She started a tradition of neglect that harmed Sula's mother. Sula saw that, and also harmed Sula as well. So the grandmother represents the ideals, okay? And Sula is not feeling it, okay? So she comes in to the house. She meets her grandmother. Her grandmother not happy to see it all. Like, you couldn't tell me you were coming back. You couldn't, had wired me up, selfish per usual. So Sula comes in catching it, okay? But this is older Sula. This is not little girl Sula, okay? And while some people may be on that, honor your mother and father, all of that, Sula was like, mother and father didn't honor me. Sula's on, she's pulling out that scripture, do not provoke wrath in your children, okay? Or you'll, just kind of get what you're going to get there. So interesting dynamic when Sula returns and encounters her grandmother. A lot of water under that bridge where Sula believes that her mother died, you guys. Although it doesn't necessarily say suicide in the text, that was the conclusion I I drew myself, because Sula said, she kind of was looking, or the grandmother was like, she was looking away, and when she looked back, she was engulfed in flames. So, oh yes, also it was also a point about the mother that day that she died, where she was wearing red. It was almost as though she knew she was going to die that day. So again, I believe Sula's mother, Eva's daughter, Hannah, committed committed suicide. And Sula blamed the dynamic of her grandmother, how she kind of focused more so on job instead of loving the child, and that's kind of what that time did. Poverty was so prevalent that mothers and fathers were being taken away from the home just to provide a living. But what it was doing, it was forcing kids to grow up too fast, neglecting them, and kind of leaving them to fend for themselves. And Sula is evidence of this. She's the aftermath, okay? So she comes in with her swords, is what I call the birds, the plague of robins. And she's just slicing the grandmother down the sides. Grandmother is hitting her with scripture. She like, I don't want to hear that, old lady. It was funny, but it was sad at the same time. Sula was produced. She was produced by neglect. So where you may want to feel like she shouldn't be talking to her grandmother that way, oh, you understand why she's talking to her grandmother that way. Okay? Her grandmother put her down. And when I say put her down, I mean she put her down to go and worry about other things. Okay? Children aren't pets. They aren't kids. They aren't going to just be waiting for you when you return, So Sula kind of came with that, that chopper, her mouth, and she was kind of letting her grandmother know where she stood, okay? So long story short, at the end of the confrontation with her grandmother, we see Sula taking over her grandmother's home as guardian and putting her grandmother in a nursing home, okay? Now, society, the public, looked at Sula like, how can you do this? Who puts their grandmother up? See, that's public. That was the public's opinion. Privately, Sula knows why she's putting her grandmother in the nursing home. No care for me, no care for you, right? And that's kind of how she moved. That, again, I say she's created by that environment, right? So after meeting with her grandmother, Sula also takes time to go and meet with her BFF, Nel. Okay, Nel and Sula, again, one of the same, best friends growing up. Nel was happy to see Sula, happy that Sula had made it back. They picked up where they left off. As friends do, as girlfriends do, those true friendships, you can be gone for years and a lot of times come back and kind of fit right back into that same spot in each other's lives. And we see that in the book with Sula and Nel, okay? Everyone at this particular point knows Sula. Sula's reputation precedes her, okay? She is Miss Steal Your Man in the bottom, okay? Sula is very mysterious. She's beautiful. She's promiscuous, but her promiscuity is almost revolutionary in that she's rejecting the societal norms of the society that rejected her, okay? So I get it, okay? I told you guys this time when I'm reading Sula, I get Sula. I really do. I get how she's moving. I get the anger, the little flicker of anger that's in her. I get how damned if I do and damned if I don't. So I'm just going to do what I do. I get that totally from Sula. And that's how she moves. But as she returns, she walks by, women are kind of clutching at men like, oh, no, you won't. Everybody kind of knows how Sula moves. So as Sula makes her way into Nel's home, we see Nel, and we also see Nel's husband, Jude, okay? Prior to Sula leaving, Sula attended Nel's wedding. So what we see take place is two friends who moved in two different directions. Nel embraced what society said any woman her age should do. You should get married and you should have kids. We kind of still see that today in 2023 to some degrees, okay? Especially the older generation. If you're 30 plus, 40 and not married, you will still get questions as in, you know, about kids or husband, you know, when that is a really prehistoric concept, you know. Just again, I'm kind of pointing out how this was 1937, you know, and they were kind of still operating in the exact same way. So without knowing it, or maybe she knew it, Nell is happy to see a friend, but she also judges her friend, okay? She thinks Sula cannot be happy, or is she really fulfilled in her life because you didn't get married? Like, are you really fulfilled in life because you didn't have any kids? And Sula is attempting to tell them, yes, I am. I'm good. I'm moving. I get to define my life for me. I get to do what I want to do. Like, I'm telling you, I'm good. And it's like Nell is almost wanting to impose the society standards from the bottom. You know, this kind of, again, is influenced by their environment. You know, kind of keep attempting to impose it on her. Also, and so is Jude. Jude is, again, Nell's husband, okay? So there's a part in here that I wanted to read really quickly. And I'm just looking at the time, just click by, you know, stay with me if you can. If it gets too long or if I get too long-winded, I totally understand. A lot of times when I'm looking through YouTube videos, I'm like, that's too long. Nope, don't have enough time to commit today. So I get it, okay? But I'm gonna go ahead and get this out. Oh, I keep kicking my camera, you guys. I'm sorry. Okay, bear with me. But, all right, so Sula and Nell catching up. They're laughing like homegirls, you know. Nell, she may question Sula's choices in life, you know, to kind of roll independent, roll solo, to kind of gawk at the societal norms on how a woman should act, how a woman should carry herself. You know, so we see that. And we kind of see Sula's responses to it. Again, Toni Morrison isn't telling you how to feel or think about this. She's not. But she's kind of just giving us the take. And it's really up to us to take from it what we will, okay? So really quickly, I want to show you guys, or read really quickly, this particular section where Sula is in conversation, because, you know, she's a traveled woman. She's college, she's sophisticated. So what I like about them, Sula, Nell, and Jude, is, you know, they're kind of, this is almost like a porch conversation, right? You know, they're really engaging in the issue. So again, Sula's not getting offended if Nell is asking her, like, I mean, are you happy? You know, why couldn't you play by the rules? You know, why couldn't, you know, Sula is kind of giving her perspective, her take, and I like it. All right. So, I'm sorry, you guys. Okay. So, again, Sula and Nell catching up. All right, so Jude walks in. This is Nell's husband, okay? He represents the unsatisfied male, rightly so. You know, Jude had big dreams for his life. He wanted to, I believe Jude wanted to, was it train? I'm having a brain fart right now, but Jude saw his life going in a particular direction, but due to the limited opportunities for Black men at this time, he was always relegated to some less than position, right? It's like his mind is brilliant. He's smart. He's creative, but no one is seeing that at this time. So he's being, you know, diverted to menial jobs, you know, let's say janitor, cleaning. And it's not at all, you know, in alignment with who he is as a person. So Jude has, you know, he's lacking satisfaction with life. You know, he's kind of in his own head, okay? So Sula picks up on this. Nel picks up on this when he walks into the house. You know, just he's unhappy. He's in a mood, okay? So Nel, as soon as her husband come in, she's attentive to her husband. You know, so she says, "Bad day, honey?" "Same old stuff," he replied, and told them a brief tale of some personal insult done him by a customer and his boss. A whiny tale that peaked somewhere between anger and a lapping desire for comfort. He ended it with the observation that a Negro man had a hard road to hoe in this world. He expected his story to dovetail into milk-warm commiseration, but before Nel could excrete it, Sula said she didn't know about that. It looked like a pretty good life to her. Okay, and I'm pausing here. I'm pausing. I'm sorry, y'all. Sula is my peeps, okay? Because that just reminded me of maybe something I do. I may be obnoxious, listen. But normally, if it comes here, it normally comes here, okay? So I like how, now the way Nel would have handled this, she would have been patting him on the back. "Oh, it's okay. You know, they don't know how wonderful you are. They don't know how great you are," right? Sorry, you guys. I keep hitting this camera. Y'all know I'm new to this, so bear with me just a second. Okay, so before Nel could even dive into that spiel, okay, Sula was like, I don't know about that, buddy. I don't know if you got it as hard as you think you have it, okay? And I know that's going to ruffle some feathers. You guys know in 2023, if you've been watching Manosphere out here, girl, they big mad at us, aren't they? That's kind of what I'm picking up. That's the energy I'm picking up. Like real life hate, okay? You know, Tupac said, if we're not careful, we're going to have a race of babies who hate the ladies who make the babies. And baby, 2023 is looking like prophecy because, you know, the kids ain't feeling us, okay? But ironically, Sula in 1937 has something to say, okay? So Sula said, "It looked like you got a pretty good life to me." And Jude said, "Say what?" Jude's temper flared just a bit as he looked at this friend of his wife's, this slight woman, not exactly plain, but not fine either, with the copperhead over her eye. Okay, he's talking about that rose birthmark. As far as he could tell, she looked like a woman roaming the country trying to find some man to burden down with a lot of lip and a lot of mouths. Okay, yeah, that's how you would look at her, Jude. I can see that. Sula was smiling. "I mean, I don't know what the fuss is about. I mean, everything in the world loves you. White men love you. They spend so much time worrying about your penis, they forget their own. The only thing they want to do is cut off an N-words privates. And if that ain't love and respect, I don't know what is. And white women, they chase you all to every corner of the earth. Feel for you under every bed. I know a white woman wouldn't leave the house after 6 o'clock for fear one of you would snatch her. Now, ain't that love? They think rape soon as they see you, and if they don't get the rape they looking for, they scream it anyway, just so the search won't be in vain. Colored women worry themselves into bad health just trying to hang on to your cuffs. Even little children, white and black, boys and girls, spend all their childhood eating their hearts out because they think you don't love them. And if that ain't enough, you love yourselves. Nothing in this world loves a black man more than another black man. You hear of solitary white men, but N-words can't stay away from one another a whole day. So it looks to me like you, the envy of the world. End quotes. Tell me Toni Morrison didn't spit. Tell me Toni Morrison didn't spit straight bars in that exchange between Sula and Jude. Which low-key in, you know, it's kind of like before you get down on yourself, she's really identifying and pointing out the power that he carries, okay? So before anybody get in my comments and get mad and want to, you know, argue back and forth with Sula, it wasn't a putting down of Jude at all. She's kind of almost saying, look on the bright side. Everybody loves you. Even if what you feel on the other end of that is hate It's obsession, babe, So she kind of points that out to him. And I remember reading that and just, almost similar to dropping the mic, I dropped the book. It's a little bit too hot up in here with that, right? But that particular perspective is what made Sula, okay? So after that, Jude and Nell were laughing, okay? So she broke a proverbial ice there, okay? Her opinion, her idea was refreshing to him. He could rock with it, okay? So, again, the house, it lightened his mood. By the end of that, they were all laughing together. And here's what Jude said. He said, well, if that's the only way they got to show it, cut off my balls and throw me in jail. I just as soon as they leave me alone. But the fact that Sula kind of had this way of looking at things, it made him kind of see Sula a little bit differently. And hence that ball starts rolling down the hill, okay? So if you guys, again, have read the book, you know what happens upon Sula's return to the bottom. With that breaking of the ice, Jude began to look at Sula a little bit differently, okay? And a funny woman, he thought, not that bad looking. But he could see why she wasn't married. She stirred a man's mind maybe, but not his body. This is what Jude is thinking. Fast forward, okay? And what ends up happening, you guys, is with the comfortability, with Sula coming and going to Nell's home, Nell comes home one day and finds her husband and Sula in a compromising position, okay? That compromising position is on all fours, okay? So with that plague of robins that kind of came in along with Sula, is the revelation that Jude, wasn't the husband that Nell thought he was, okay? So, and I know I'm just kind of glazing over this, you guys. This is a bombshell if you have not read the book, or even when you read the book. Did anybody's jaw literally drop when you understood what was happening when Nell walked in that room and saw her man and her best friend? And I mean BFF. Her and Sula like almost wore the same skin type of friends, okay? So what we see after that is Nell kind of going through this grieving process, okay? And it's very mental. So Toni Morrison is she puts us in Nell's head. This is that private that becomes public, okay? So normally a person who gets cheated on by their spouse with their best friend, there's a shame associated with that publicly we may see, but privately we may not know what's going on. So Toni Morrison gives us a glimpse into that private moment where Nell is processing the information. She's in the bathroom. She feels nauseous. She feels sick. She feels lightheaded. She feels like she may faint. She is reeling from the reality that I've stood on this marriage like it gives me purpose in this world. And that thing was on a sandcastle. I'm really not, it really wasn't as solid as I thought it was. Even though low key, you guys, Nell knew she was making do with Jude, okay? That's making the private public. She may not tell him that. She may not tell you that. It may not look like it on the outside, but she knew that on the inside, okay? And as you can kind of see, as she's going through the feelings, what she's really doing, you guys, she's mourning the loss of her friendship more than anything. And I read it, and I read it again and again. It's not about Jude. It was not about Jude. The hurt and the pain that Nell really, from what I'm in, this is me reading, again, me participating in the information. What I pulled from it is that what hurt so bad was Sula. That's what hurt her. And it hurt her that Now I got to let go of my friendship. And I don't want to. She really didn't want to let Sula go. Now, this is ironic because we know how sometimes a friend can kind of come in, and what a person will do immediately is hop on the side of the boyfriend or husband, because he was a husband. And rightfully so.